This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Heretic Happy Hour, whose tagline is burning questions, not people. You know, we've been around for a long time now, and we've had many different lineups, and Heretic Happy Hour is only getting bigger and better, with guest hosts like Rainn Wilson, David Bentley Hart, John Fugelsang, Candida Moss, Elaine Pagels, and of course, December Rose. 2024 and 2025 are turning out to be our best years yet. So check us out on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's Heretic Happy Hour. We hope to see you soon.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney and Bethany Shea.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Nat Turney. I'm here as always with my brother, John. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
And always as always. I almost always get to the intro with little to no. Never mind. We all know that's not true. We are also joined by our third bonus, amazing,
bonus?
Well, she's a bonus. I mean,
I'm always a bonus.
Yes, that's why she's extra. I bet you've been told that a lot in your life. You're a lot.
You know what? I have the lasting charm of a gentle and quiet spirit. So I don't know what you're talking about.
No, I meant that in the best possible way. I was gonna try and find some other words besides like loquacious but
liberal.
Well, yeah, but I mean, golly, she is definitely. Anyway, Bethany, say hello to everybody.
Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here as always.
As always, we are here with another episode of the podcast that we call "This Is Not Church," because if it was church, you would get the hell out of here. You might have not even made it this far. Although, to be fair, if I was ever going to go back to church and I could be guaranteed that the guy might say some stupid shit like I just said, I might stick around just to see where it's going.
Have you ever thought of planting a church? I'm just kidding. You already did that.
I did. I'll show you the scars. You know what? To be fair, my experience with planting a church was great. It really was. I'm just terrible at it. I'm bad at the things that make church successful.
I hear you, man. Mother's Day was yesterday, wherever we're recording today, but there's a lot of churches that put up some sort of a banner in the background and you can do photos in front of it. And it's just so sweet. And it's like everything in me just wants to barf. I just can't. I cannot create spaces like that. I appreciate those spaces for them. We will never market our church. Like all of those sorts of things just feel really gross to me. And so, your church won't grow unless you put yourself out there and market. But I can't.
I was terrible at that. I wrote in my first book. I say that like I wrote more than one. I wrote it in this book I wrote that one of the turning points for me in my deconstruction was going to a staff meeting at a church I was on staff at, and having somebody come in. They hired a consultant to help us with church marketing, and I just about threw up in my mouth. Yeah. Just those two words put together, and then just to hear the like elevator pitch of like, you know, like a McDonald's or Coke CEO talking about the product we were trying to sell. And I was like, but I was bad at other things as well. I'm bad at organization. I routinely forget to ask for money because that always just felt terrible. And so,
we're terrible at that too.
We basically self-funded for like 3 years before we decided, on to do other things. But that's not why we're here. We're here to talk to Eric. And let me introduce our guest. Back with us for the second time, Eric Scot English, who is the writer who writes the UNenlightenment column for Patheos Progressive Christian. He also hosts a podcast called UNenlightenment, where he interviews leading Christian thinkers or thinkers in the Christian faith about various topics associated with progressive Christianity and evangelicalism. He holds advanced degrees in philosophy and theology, and his latest book is called The Kingdom of Man, and it is by our favorite publishers, Choir. So he's a Choir brother, and we just are glad to have him back. Welcome back to the podcast, Eric. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm great. Hey, and really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, man, we're so glad that we didn't run you off entirely the first time. That's great. You came back for more.
Entirely.
And when you were here the first time, we didn't have the added bonus guest or the bonus host.
The bonus host.
The boast. That's terrible. That's not even clever. It's just like, the boastest with the mostest. Jeez. I wish we had video for everyone now, because you just like gave me like this really terrible thumbs down, like You're awful. Like, she's literally getting up from her chair and going to go find her husband so he can start to kick my ass. But anyway, but we didn't have, it was just John and I. And so we have since been joined by Bethany, who brings an awful lot to the table. She evens John and I out, and she's John and I are a bit cynical, and Bethany is very optimistic. I like that. I don't understand it, but I like it. So tell us about what's been going on it's been a couple of years, right, Eric? I think it's been a while.
Yeah, the last time I was on, it was I just written UNenlightenment. It was on deconstruction, and so now had a new book. Did a lot of research for the Kingdom of Man, and basically spent the last few years doing that. So,
all right, well, talk us through this, the Kingdom of Man. I'm intrigued. What's the basic premise?
Well, let me start by saying why I wrote it.
Sure.
I was puzzled. I still am to some extent puzzled why intelligent people whom I respect, fall so easily as victims to things like white Christian nationalism. It just doesn't make sense for me. It's like all of this, when it comes to the politics, it seems like rationality and logic go out the window, and all of these ideologies, and these are people whom I respect, or, and people who have advanced degrees and different things like that. And it really bothered me, and it didn't make sense. And then I began doing some research, and now we'll move into the book itself. Began doing some research and realized that throughout the history of conservative evangelicalism, they were basically groomed for this moment, for this time in history. And looking at the broader brushstroke of history and the evolution that's taken place within, and I should qualify specifically, conservative evangelicalism, that there have been these steps along the way. And what I do is I document those different steps that led to this thing. And not only that, but a lot of other things you may not think are connected, like racism, the exclusion of women, different things like that. They are all related under this power structure. And it's everything they do is meant to bolster that power structure. And so what I didn't want to do was go through and write a book about how evil evangelicals are.
Yeah, for sure.
Good.
And it turned out that really evangelicals, conservative evangelicals, and I'm not going to qualify every time I say that, but that's what I mean, are victims too. They're victims of what I refer to as subliminalism, and just this sort of ongoing propaganda that's very subvert and has just gone to create this worldview. And that's why they can say things like, I support, say, Donald Trump, even though he might do these things that are contrary to the gospel. Because they see their rationale is so different, because they've been, maybe groomed isn't the right word, I'm not sure, but they've been prepared for this day, this moment.
Yeah. I don't know. Groomed seems appropriate, because prepared is one thing, but prepared almost implies a participation on the side of the person who's going along with this preparation. Grooming is almost against someone's will, whether by manipulation or coercion. I think you're right. I think they've been lied to a whole lot. I'm not letting them off the hook entirely, because I still think it plays into some of their baseline biases and things like that. However, I'm like you. I'm not willing to just whitewash or paint with a broad brush an entire spectrum of our population. But I'm like you also. I'm beyond puzzled. I'm confused, and I'm angry that people that I have known and respected and who are otherwise rational, intelligent people have seemed to jettison all of that.
Yeah, but wouldn't you say on the same side that we've all been groomed to some degree or another? Like I think that all of us we've all been, depending on our sources and what we're listening to, we're all kind of in that group think tank. And Eric, you wrote about that a little bit in the book, this sense of like we have this group think around us all the time that affirms our original biases. And so I just appreciate how you're like wanting to be compassionate towards people who have been groomed in that direction that has been negative to the gospel.
Definitely.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, Nat.
No, please do jump in anytime. I have a tendency to ramble on, but but I'm with you. So talk us through that process of because another word I would use besides groomed is perhaps indoctrinated.
That's a good word.
And that starts for a lot of us when we're not even I wasn't even old enough to know what that meant when I was already being immersed in this version of the gospel.
I often get asked the question, well, how do you know that what you're proposing is not just the other end of the spectrum opposite of what I believe? Like, you're just operating within your biases and I might be operating within mine. And aren't we both equally allowed to operate within those biases? And my answer is always the same. And that is, yes, absolutely. The difference is I consider both biases. I consider both sides. You usually, to the more fundamentalist type, only consider one view and are never open to the possibility that you could be wrong. And therefore, you can never know if it's right.
Yeah. I was at a Theology on Tap group last week, and we were talking about the Pope and the new Pope that just came in. And one of the guys there said, the difference between conservative and progressive Christianity is that oftentimes progressive Christians want to create this wide, big tent that allows for all sorts of varying opinions and beliefs to be under it. And there's room for disagreement. But the problem is that, so we can invite the conservative Christians in. It doesn't go the same direction or the other direction though. The conservative Christians, it's like, if you don't fit in the box, then you can't come in. And that can be really hurtful. I'm curious, have you been a part of this, like what you call conservative evangelicalism in the past? And what has that deconstruction looked like for you? You may have mentioned that on your previous podcast with us, but I wasn't on it.
That's all right. I actually reiterated, I think in the introduction, briefly. But, so I became a Christian in a Fundamentalist Baptist church when I was 16. And I was a myriad of circumstances. I was on my own, and I was highly depressed, suicidal, like all these things that was common among teens of the 90s. I won't say how old I am, but that's the best you get. Teens of the 90s. And but immediately the church split. And the political stuff, I was introduced to that right away because our pastor, who I was good friends with his daughter, allowed his daughter to go to prom. And if you're getting Footloose vibes, that's all you got to do. Watch the movie and that's the rest of it right there. He ended up having a heart attack from the stress and they ended up leaving. And
wow,
it was a whole mess. And so that was my introduction into Christianity as a whole. From there, I went to a conservative, both conservative college and 2 conservative seminaries. And so deconstruction happened in the second seminary that I attended. I had a wide, let's see, how do I say this? I was at I don't want to name names, so I'm just trying to be careful. The institution I was at, it was a highly regarded institution with well-known theological and philosophy professors. And I was told at one point that in a paper that I had written that I wasn't, what's the word I'm looking for? I wasn't allowed to invoke my own opinion. Instead, all research papers were allowed to do was regurgitate what you learned. So I began thinking, and that was so puzzling to me, but that's where indoctrination started creeping in. And then I began reflecting upon my education in the past, and it all just sort of became a crisis of faith, really. And so I ended up graduating there and then spent a lot of time after that starting over.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the seminary because Nat and I were brought up in the church in the 70s, and part of what you talk about in here is I can't say the word.
Dispensationalism.
Dispensationalism. Thank you. And how that creeps into and Nat and I don't know if Nat remembers this, but that was what was preached almost every single Sunday.
Oh yeah. We were waiting for the end times, baby.
Right. And what I find interesting is, and I found this out much later in my education, is that that's what was being taught in the seminary. Is like, you need to understand that what you need to preach is this, because the end times are coming, and they're coming within this generation, and you need to prepare everybody for it. And it was just like they bought it hook, line, sinker, and just ran with it without a lot of education into where that all came from, which you talk about a little bit in the book as well, right?
Yeah, I have a story I told in the other UNenlightenment book. I believe it was in that one. I had a theology professor, and he was a very dispensationalist, and it was a class on the prophets. And he was going through, I don't even remember the prophet. All I remember is the context. It was one of the prophets that starts talking about the 7 cities of such and such. So this professor went and started naming the 7 cities or the 6 cities of the past, and then something like the 7th city would be in the future, and blah, blah, blah. So then I mentioned to him, I said, well, what about this city and this city? These are all even bigger than the cities you mentioned. It seems like there's more than just 6. And his response was so awful. He said, but if we want to believe inerrancy is true, we have to believe it that way. A theology professor who other professors use his books as textbooks.
Wow. It boggles the mind. I mean, what's really funny to me is I've been watching, there's a guy named Dan McClellan who's got a YouTube channel, and he's a graduate level theologian, can read and write in biblical Hebrew and Koine Greek and all this stuff, right? So just a super smart guy, right? And what I'm learning from him is that as evangelical Christians, we never learned to read the Old Testament except through the lens of the New Testament. So we force the Old Testament into prophetic truths that aren't there, prophecies that aren't. I was raised believing that every biblical prophecy in the Old Testament points directly to Jesus. Most of them don't have a damn thing to do with Jesus at all. They all have to do with their own generations and what's happening in their own struggles with exile and all kinds of stuff. But we've shoehorned so much of that into this picture that we've convinced ourselves that our rendition of biblical prophecy is the correct one. And it's really strange, but it was so ingrained in John and I, and John, this might be your experience as well. I was shocked to find out that other mainline denominations don't teach this at all. I mean, Methodists, Presbyterian, most mainline denominations they reject this whole dispensational thing almost utterly. But it was taught so matter-of-factly to us that it was a humongous shock. And when that was like one of the first real big pieces of my deconstruction, was taking all of that and going, well, that's all bullshit. I can put that aside. And I can't tell you how freeing that was to not be concerned about the imminent trumpet sound. John and I were raised at a time when people, we lived in California, and I had my friend's mom, every time there was an earthquake, she thought it was the second coming. She's freaking out. She's going and checking her kids' beds to make sure they're still there, or they'd been taken, or she'd been left. But anyway, let me ask you this then, on the heels of that, are there other large pieces of doctrine that you've come along and went like, okay, that's not true either? I mean, I could think of things like, different atonement theories. I can think, and things like that were big for you, that were like, kind of, you could just kind of push to the side.
Well, I mean, the two that stand out are inerrancy and the various atonement theories.
Yeah, for sure.
But for me, it was, I've always sought the truth, not a denomination or even Christianity. I just wanted to know what was true. And I think that has been my saving grace throughout the years. I never let go of that, and never felt really beholden to any of those groups. With that said, I have been in bondage, if you will, to certain doctrines that I call inerrancy the scientific method of evangelicalism, the unscientific method of evangelicalism, I should say. That everything is based on that doctrine. That is such a fundamental doctrine to everything else that if you blow that up, the whole thing blows up. And people are just not emotionally, psychologically prepared to deal with stuff like that. But now we're seeing consequences of people failing to deal with these realities as they begin seeping into our culture.
Yeah, where are you seeing that, the realities that people are dealing with? How do you see that in our culture?
So earlier you were talking about the anachronistic reading of the New Testament into the Old Testament. The reason the book is called The Kingdom of Man and not The Kingdom of God is because really what these groups of Christians are trying to usher in the kingdom of God, and in so doing are really only ushering in their own kingdom, because they're not doing anything that is biblical. In fact, what I should back up, I don't like that word biblical. So their anachronistic reading of the Old Testament allows them to say things like, God has favored America. No, God favored Israel. When you see things like the nations, they're not talking about you. It's talking about Israel. It's not talking about America. They use that same anachronistic reading that they use for the Bible for the Constitution.
Wow. Okay.
And so then it's little things like that once you start plotting all these things, these historical things, everything starts to come into focus.
Yeah, that's wild. It is a strange thing to, because the other place I see this creep in, and I see this amongst conservative evangelicals more than anybody else, is if you adhere first and foremost to a literal / inerrant version of the Bible, you have to do certain things like deny science. Like there's no way you can't accept anything but a literal 6-day creation, which means all kinds of mental gymnastics have to happen for you to explain speciation and biodiversity and all these kinds of things that supposedly happen within like 4,000 years.
Why creationism is so diverse, because there's all these different ways of trying to reconcile that.
Yeah, and it's very true. It's the one, because John and Bethany know me well enough to know I go down rabbit holes in YouTube. Is just it's not the best thing for me. I could get sucked in, but for about a year solid, I was just really into understanding what the hell is going on with flat earthers. That's weird. Those guys are all nut jobs. And I don't mean that flippantly. I mean seriously. You have to be a certain kind of nut job to propose flat earth. You also have to be kind of dumb. You won't find a degree holder amongst any of the major, you know what I'm saying? Creationism is a different animal. There are people holding PhDs who will argue for some version of either creationism, maybe not a young earth creation, but there are PhD level people who hold to a 6-day creation, young earth creation model. And they know enough to the uneducated like me. I mean, if I was just listening to them, they could make a lot of sense. When you start listening to the vast majority of scientists who say that's all terrible and all of their science is bad, and it all starts with a conclusion that they try to then backdoor solution into, which is what they normally do. But that's a different animal. You can sort of dismiss the one as, okay, that's just freaks and weirdos. And then you have this sort of other mainstream group of people who, some of whom are very well educated, but because they hold to this view of the Bible, like they cannot let that go. They've got to then wrap all of their other thinking and findings into this view of the Bible that's inerrant. So that means you got to believe in a biblical flood, a Tower of Babel somehow or other. There's all these things that have to fit in. Genocides that never happened and all kinds of other weird stuff. But do you see a connection between that kind of science denial and where we are today with, say, maybe, I don't know, how about the people who are like anti-vaxxers? Because I can't trust the science over here, I must not be able to trust the science over here. Any connection in your mind to that, or those separate issues?
So it's all, and I outline this in the book, it's all based on one's perspective of how to ascertain truth in reality in the world around you. And I want to suggest, first and foremost, whether that's flat earthers or who we're talking about, people I think many at the upper levels, the leadership of these various things all know better.
Yeah, I agree.
I think many of them know better, even within Christianity.
It's a
know
gift.
what they're doing.
Yeah.
And know that they're spreading falsehoods. But again, it's that power dynamic, but I digress. So it's all based on how we view the world around us. And that's what feeds into, and I talk about the role that Hegelianism has played in our Western thinking, in regards to truth. And actually what's funny is, and I say this, I think in chapter 2, fundamentalists are not as far from science as they may think or wish they were. They both operate within the modern worldview. It's that they both come at the modern worldview from two different perspectives, but they're not entirely different in how they form their conclusions. Like we saw in the 20th century, this burst of systematic theologies come forth. That's an example of using scientific methodology to produce a theology that is close to absolute truth as you can get. Because if you adhere to the rules of the system, which is Hegelianism, if you adhere to those rules, you'll be able to ascertain what absolute truth is. And boy, doesn't that work great with a doctrine like inerrancy.
Yeah, for sure. Nothing like a good formula, right?
It's a great little package.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes you feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for those who may not be familiar, and I may count myself among the, talk about Hegelianism. I know you're a philosophy guy, so I'm lacking in the area. But what do you mean by that?
We'll say early 1800s, Hegel, German philosopher, began to develop what he arrogantly referred to as the end of all philosophy. He believed that there existed in nature a formula where if the right information is put into this formula, that absolute truth can be found. This is within German idealism. There's also, by the way, a Christian idealism, which is what I refer to as what's going on right now. But within German idealism, he made that claim, and that's that's basically the scientific method. There's a thesis, there's an antithesis, and then there is the synthesis. So there is the thesis, that's the thing you want to check out, the antithesis, which is the opposite. Those two things bounce back and forth until a synthesis is retrieved, which is the conclusion you draw. And this was during a time where the church was struggling to regain power. And so they really needed to latch onto something that could bring the people. And there's a lot of like state churches throughout Europe and stuff like that. So they really wanted to wrangle their people. And so they went all in on this absolutism. And Hegel, by the way, is considered the father of modernism, which probably a lot of your viewers are more aware of than Hegelianism. And then a little frail man by the name of Kierkegaard came on the scene. And top hat and all, and said, it's all rubbish. You're an arrogant fool, and your whole system is derived out of your own mind. Therefore, it's not natural, it's subjective.
Way to go.
That's all he has to say. I mean, he wrote tomes and tomes, but that's really essentially what he's saying. And he said, and I have this quote at the beginning of the book, what looks like politics and imagines itself to be political will one day unmask itself as a religious movement. And I mean, he was just a cultural prophet. He saw right away that this won't work, and this is what will happen if the church continues down this path. And it's exactly what the church did.
Yeah. Kierkegaard is one that I am familiar with. I cite him a little bit in some of my writing as well, especially when it comes to things like groupthink. The title of one of his famous works is "The Crowd is Untruth," and essentially, wherever you have large gatherings of people, you are bound to find. You are not. I used to say that, and that's a huge difference to me between the way I used to look at the world and the way I look at the world now. Used to find comfort in numbers. You go, well, lots of people believe this. There must be something to it. And now I'm so distrustful of large groups of people coming to a consensus that I'm like, there's probably some bullshit in there that we have yet to suss out. But that's more of it. And I guess I know the name. I know the word. I know the name Hegel. I hadn't really studied any of those German thinkers, but it's weird to me, the little bit that I do know about philosophy and the little bit of exposure that I have, that anyone would claim to arrive at certainty through philosophy. Because it seems to me the antithesis of the point, which is most philosophy, professors I've had or people I've, would not make that claim. I mean, you're talking about a large unknowable thing. Go ahead, sir.
No, I was just going to say, so Kierkegaard was also a humorist. So he would say things like, he hated professors. But professors of philosophy are nothing more than historians. Little things like that are really profound, succinct and profound, and really give pause to what the task is that many of these people are doing. And Hegel's thinking was, if it's in nature, then it must be, and nature is the thing we're trying to understand, then why not think, well, it interprets itself.
Yeah.
This is what he saw in nature. And so, and science, of course, that became the foundation for the scientific method.
I'm curious about how you came to the name of your book, The Kingdom of Man. Is it from that whole idea of how political the church has become and how it's become this movement? Or what is the reason for that?
For me, it's not, I don't think, wait, let me say this right. People should be involved in politics. And people should voice their opinions. And people should debate, ask questions of their leaders. I think the problem is when a small group of people are making decisions based on an ideology for the larger group that's not in the best interest of that larger group, that's nationalism, and that's dangerous. And really, when you add the church component to that, I mean, throughout history, has it ever worked, really? The church in control of things? Come on. We can't even control our own people. How are we going to control a whole nation? It's just, and the division, I mean, the denominations alone, the thousands of denominations, you don't agree? Go down the road to the next church. There's somewhere something, the consumerism and just everything that exists with it. I'm curious. The questions I ask are more fundamental, like what parts of these are true? Not is it all true, but there's got to be some truth in this. I'm not going to throw it all out. And sifting through all those different areas and trying to see things like history in the way it was meant to be viewed more factually as I can. But even that's problematic. To try to but arrive at this truth. So you asked the question about the Kingdom of Man. So I don't know if you guys have read Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen.
Oh, yeah.
So that was sort of the inspiration it got me thinking in this direction. And I thought, what if I was to look at sort of the philosophical and theological underpinnings? So she looked at sort of like the cultural, historical aspects. If I added theology and philosophy to that discussion, what would I find? And so that's where the Kingdom of Man comes from. Now, the Kingdom of Man is just that, what I had mentioned earlier, that fabrication, that creation of what you're selling to your own people, which is that you're trying to bring about the kingdom of God, which of course isn't in the Bible anywhere, but for some reason people think they can do that. Bring forth heaven on earth or the kingdom of God through political means, forcing other people to adhere to things that they just shouldn't have to believe. The same freedoms that protect religious people from believing their beliefs are the same freedoms that should protect everybody. And if you take it away from other people, then why should you also have them? Why is your perspective the only one? And I also didn't want to write a book that just complained. I wanted hope. What would it look like for evangelicalism to come out of this somewhat whole? Like Can they? Is there a way? What would that look like? It is grim. It's very grim, and it's hard, and it would take courage. But people have to. It's almost like another Reformation. I don't like speaking like in extremes like that, but in this particular case, evangelicalism needs a Reformation if they're going to survive. Whether or not their theology will allow them to do that, or whether or not they'll just end up in the same spot again, who knows? But there's got to be some way of just letting the people think for themselves. Let them ask questions. Let them do these things that don't restrict them from doing that. And be curious. Be curious together. The thing that all humans have is we're human. We're all in this journey together. And we all are trying to figure this thing called life out. And we need to use those resources, the resources of other people, to understand what that means. Sorry, I got preaching. My bad.
No, it's good. I like it.
That's good. I was just going to say, I mean, going back to the seminary part of this, you're saying, we need a place where we can ask questions and be curious. But what I see is a seminary that teaches how to regurgitate, not to think. Then you have pastors who stand up in front of congregations who regurgitate and ask them not to think. And so you have a congregation that thinks they don't have to think. They just need to listen. I mean, that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah. And those who are, dare to take on the establishment are ostracized.
Yeah, for sure.
Now they're called liberal.
I know, right? Yeah. I was warned. My father-in-law came to my house one time and saw my collection of Karl Barth books, and he was like, that guy's kind of a liberal. I'm like, really? I mean,
his book's called Church Dogmatics.
I mean, it was maybe in the 30s and the 40s, he was probably outside the box. Now he's like, I don't know. I still don't really understand most of Barth, but I need someone to write a Karl Barth for Dummies book, because it's tough sledding to get through Church Dogmatics, man. I ain't gonna lie.
Yeah, there actually is a book out there like that.
I need to find it. I saw a Kierkegaard for Dummies once, and I almost grabbed it just for shits and giggles. It had illustrations. I was like, this book has drawings. I'm like, that's a book for me. But so much of that is I don't know. The seminary thing is interesting to me, because what I've found is that in the more think of places like Harvard and Princeton and places where they have, and Duke, and I know professors at those colleges. That is not what they do. They are in the business of challenging and getting their students to question a lot and teaching. So I think a lot of what we think of as seminary is little more than Bible college.
Yeah,
especially
I should have clarified.
Well, especially if they're denominationally driven or run. I mean, there's denominations that have their own seminaries, and they're, it seems to me they'd be more inclined to teach their own doctrine more than, hey, question everything, challenge everything, like everybody, But that was exactly the kind of seminary I was discouraged from ever even thinking about attending when I was a teenager, and I had my first inkling that I might go to seminary. And they always, they thought cleverly, they would call it cemetery. Why do you want to do that? That's where your faith goes to die, in cemetery. Because a lot of people do come out of seminaries like that, having had their faith challenged, having had a lot of their presuppositions, backed against the wall, and they had to either defend them or not. So maybe it does create a small portion of atheists. It also creates a whole bunch of free thinkers who are, maybe out there tilting at windmills. But I don't even know if there was a question in that, other than...
I mean, just look at the amount of atheists that deconstruction has produced.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't have to.
No.
But what else are people don't know how to think differently. They are so trained to think in either ors that they can't envision a world outside of that. And so it's either he exists or he doesn't. It's either what I've always believed or it's not. And they don't understand that's not even how life works.
Yeah. Well, and that's the system, though, that's created that. It's created that false dichotomy of it's either this or nothing. And so there is that temptation to come out and go, well, if I think you can approach all of these issues like that, right? When I first started maybe struggling with the idea of biblical inerrancy, there was a temptation to throw the Bible out completely. Because if it's not 100% factually, then what use is it? And if you dig a little deeper, you go, actually, it doesn't need to. In fact, I think it detracts from its legitimacy to bind it over to this rigid sense of inerrancy and literalism. It robs the Bible of so much nuance and meaning. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I don't really give a shit if Jonah really got swallowed by a whale. That's kind of boring to me. But there's bigger stories. There's bigger storylines in that of prejudice and bias and an unwillingness to care for someone you don't like. And man, those are way more interesting to me than whether or not some giant fish actually swallowed a human and spat him up on dry land someplace else. So maybe that's something that a book like yours helps to tackle, is like, we don't need these false dichotomies of it's either this or that. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, right? Or at least I like that. I like the idea of synthesis, of saying, okay, I can take the parts of this that make sense to me and reject the parts that are terrible and make a synthesis of this that still keeps the spirit of I think, what scriptures want to teach us without putting us into a box. What do you think?
I say just let the Bible interpret itself.
Ooh, what do you mean? Tell us more.
Oh, we can't end with that awesome quote.
That's one of my least favorite things people say. Go ahead.
Yeah. So it's anachronistic when you begin reading your own cultural context, your own worldviews, different things like that into ancient documents. And instead of allowing those documents to speak on their own terms within their own context, and it may come out not as entertaining, or it may come out where it doesn't match your theology. And that should be okay. But because we've created these systems of thinking, we inevitably are stuck reading things in our Calvinistic worldview, our dispensationalist worldview, our Wesleyan worldview. Like that's, and you had mentioned something about denominational seminaries. I mean, that's what they're known for, right? They're just training their own people to think a certain way. And I don't know if there's anything wrong with that. I think that there's probably a way you can do that and allow people to think for themselves at the same time. But I'm not in education, so I don't know what that looks like. But yeah, just allow, regardless of the outcome, if you okay, so here's the thing. So one of my big premises in the book is this, we talked about German idealism and Hegel. I believe there's a Christian idealism that takes place. And that Christian idealism is what we are seeing in the world, or in America at least, but also more broadly around the world today. And that is that God is, I don't want to say figment of the imagination as much as he doesn't get any further to reality for those people than their minds. Do they really think that God is walking with them daily? They say it, but do they really think it? Do the behaviors, the acts that you see indicate that? God is such a mental construct for them that they never can appreciate the reality of what God is doing in the world. And because what God might be doing in the world might contradict their theology or how they've come to understand that God works. And that's the same thing the religious leaders in Jesus' time struggled with. Jesus was a radical only because they were so stuck in a particular mindset of how truth worked that they were never able to see beyond that. And that's exactly the same thing that Christian idealists struggle with today.
So how would you encourage somebody to think beyond those ideals? How would you encourage people to come before the Bible with a more of an open perspective, I guess?
So there's a lot of the church has hurt a lot of people, but the church is also a part of community. And I don't want to throw church out, maybe the institution of the church, but I don't want to throw community out. And I think that we become lone rangers in this process, and we are not, and we need not accountability, but we need friends to come along and do life together with us, to help us, to keep us keep the hope going and to struggle with us and all these things that are much more authentic than I'm going to project this worldview to the world and say, this is what Christianity is. Whether you can live up to that or not, this is what it is. Is that image is so far, because it's a mental image, it's not a reality. It's so far removed from reality, nobody can ever attain it. And so in conservative evangelicalism, your whole life is consumed by trying to attain that ideal, and you never will. And so, to quote Kierkegaard again, Christianity ceased to exist once it became legal.
Yeah, I like that.
It's that once it was legal, the reality of the persecution that was taking place and the reality of the role that God played within that, it just disappeared. And nothing's changed since.
I feel like the ideal of specifically the conservative evangelical is very muddled. Is it about saving the world? Is it about making abortion illegal? Is it about, there's so many different little topics that they deem as important in their life, that what is the Christian ideal when it comes to the fundamentalist evangelical?
The problem is it's so manufactured that things like the abortion debate, right? So this was a product of Francis Schaeffer, who someone tapped on his shoulder and said, the abortion debate was really about racism. And it surrounded the debate of whether or not interracial couples could, date and be together. And was that something that the church should allow? And they didn't want to allow that. And so they created this issue to subvert interracial marriage at places like Bob Jones. And as a result of that, it became, and I include these surveys, or initial surveys for the first few years after Roe v. Wade, that Christians or conservatives were largely for the abortion. And even more, like those that are sort of more fundamentalist were more apt to say, we still don't like it, but we recognize that there are certain situations where it might be necessary, right? And so that whole thing changed, and Francis Schaeffer was responsible for making that change. But, all I want to do and all I'm trying to do is say, here's the evidence. Look at it. This clearly shows you that this issue you've been so passionate about was completely manufactured for political power. It's all right here. I didn't make it up. I have no liberal agenda. This is the evidence. And you can look it up yourself. It's there.
Yeah, and once that issue was sort of won, for lack of a better term, with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, now you see that same group of people. They had to find a new enemy. And they've targeted LGBTQ folks and more specifically trans folks, because that's still a boogeyman that even a lot of people who claim to be somewhat progressive, they still struggle with that trans issue. They may not have an issue with gays and lesbians, like the LGB part, right? But they still struggle with the trans issue. And that, I think that's a place where conservative evangelicals feel like they can still find a foothold and scare people with all kinds of horseshit about, women and men's sports. And, every time I see another evangelical knucklehead being brought up on charges of pedophilia or human trafficking, I'm like, look, yet another not drag queen, yet another not trans person, yet another person who's yelling the loudest about family values, who's now, it literally just happened today. And I can't remember who it was I saw, but it was somebody fairly prominent who's going to jail probably for his part in some child abuse scandal. What I get worried about is that the mainstream church, and again, the problem with it is the mainstream church isn't most Christians. It's just the loudest group of these people, at least I think.
Or the most interesting.
Yeah. And the most controversial, the right. And they say the most outlandish things, but they've desensitized a whole population of people to the harm the church itself is capable of. And rather than be honestly looking inward and saying, okay, what culpability do we have here? What role did we play in this? I think the Catholic Church still has a lot of reckoning to do for their part in all of this. But no more so than the Baptist Church and whatever other churches that have facilitated and enabled this kind of behavior. So when you talk about how does evangelicalism emerge from this, I hope they don't emerge from this hole. I hope they don't. I'm not even sure. I hope they emerge. But if they do emerge, they need to be radically different. And I'm not sure they have enough honesty. Or they're willing to give up that chunk of power that they've spent so many years amassing. Most reformations don't happen from the inside out. Someone's going to have to nail something to a door somewhere. And people usually have to be dragged kicking and screaming into the future. And I don't know, maybe you're more optimistic than I am, but what do you see as the possible outcome of this? Do you see that it might have to be an outward and an outside in kind of thing? Or do you see there's the capacity for some self-awareness where they might go, hey, if we're going to survive, we have to do this?
Unfortunately, I don't think it'll ever be the way it was.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
I think the only two options are it blows up or it completely reforms.
Yeah.
But I don't think that it will ever be make America great again.
Yeah.
It'll never be like the 50s.
No, and honestly, for a lot of people who lived through the 50s, good. They probably would be like, yeah, it wasn't good for everybody. My dad loves to talk about the good old days. I'm like, well, they weren't good for everybody, Dad. I mean, there were some people who had some pretty rotten times. I'm hopeful. I guess let me couch my skepticism and my cynicism in. There's a little hope there, but my hope lies in its destruction. My hope lies in, I hope it collapses, because I don't think it's ever going to be exposed for the sham that it is while it's still propped up. And while these things are still sort of manufactured and artificially held up, something has to be exposed to the light. And
it doesn't matter what's exposed, though. What else could possibly be exposed that hasn't already, and people still aren't turning away from it?
I know.
I feel like, and this is such a strange thing to say, I feel like I'm a missionary to Christians.
No, I 100% agree.
I feel like, how many people can I save before this thing collapses?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that's crazy at all. I think you're one of many people like shouting fire, going, hey, like I'm not kidding. Y'all need to get the hell out of this burning building because it's about to be really, really ugly. Now, it might be 50 years. I don't know. I don't know what the timeline is. Every time I think, not to invoke the name of the current occupant of the White House, but every time I think he's done something that will finally wake his people up, I am just proved wrong. And they just dig their heels in and go, and well, he's going to suspend, habeas corpus and just start tossing people in jail. Yep, good. What do you mean good? You people love the Constitution and he's shitting all over it, and you can't get enough because he's shitting on the right people is the problem. And that's the same thing religion has always done. It's always punched down. It's always attacked the right people. And so it's easy to pick on people who are already marginalized and pronounce doom and gloom over them because most of us aren't them. And we go, I'm not, I'm just, the Bible says, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know, man. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think a fundamental part of that is books like you are writing, people like other people are writing who are, I think, making a good case that you're not doing this simply to attack, but also, but to at least facilitate some evolution. Like, I still believe in the church, but it's going to have to do some change. Is that kind of a motif in your book that I don't want to oversimplify it, but
no, I believe in people and community and in God. And, but I also believe that, we're all equal and all human and we should all be treating each other differently.
And no better place than the church to start.
Well, that's where it's supposed to be, right?
Isn't that what
history is so cyclical?
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't learn from anything, it seems, except for how to try to be better at being bad.
Okay. On all fairness, we are getting pretty good at that. gold star for being terrible.
I think that the church, I believe very greatly in the church. And I believe that if we are following in Jesus' way, that the church should be known for death and resurrection. And so I do believe that a lot of what is taking place in the church has to die. And as much as I would love to see new life come about through what is already happening, I just don't see that possible. I'm really sad about that, because it is hard to see things die, but I just can't see it being reborn or being something new coming out of this corrosive space right now. And it's really hard to see that. Where do you feel like there is hope moving forward? Do you have hope within Christianity, within the church?
Hope. There is none. It's got to be, if there is any hope, it's got to be in something different. It's the unfortunate truth. The more people that can come to realize that maybe their leaders don't have their best interests in mind, I think the more people we might be able to salvage when it burns to the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. Where do you find hope in your own life? Like in your own communal spaces?
For me, I feel grateful to attend a church within a mainline denomination, the RCA, and they give us quite a bit of freedom. And I don't agree with, I'm not even a Reformed theologian, but they give us enough freedom to be able to struggle together. And we have leadership in place that cares about people and doesn't care about things like their sexuality or what. Like, why is that any of our business? We are just called to love people, right? That's how they'll know that you're my disciples, by how they're treated. I don't know why that's so hard. And I mean, that's what we try to do. And I just feel fortunate. And, I'm from West Michigan. If you know anything about West Michigan, it is very much a Bible belt. And very conservative. And so we are a very tiny light in the midst of craziness.
I'm with you. I'm hopeful I have hope in people. I've lost whatever hope I ever had in institutions. I just don't think it's possible for institutions to give us what we need. I don't think they're designed to be that way. All too often they're designed to preserve themselves at the expense of the people that they're meant to serve. So I'm done with institutions, although like you, I value community. I need people to come alongside me. And quite frankly, I need people to tell me I'm full of shit when I'm full of shit. It's easy enough to get into an echo chamber, whatever your political leanings or religious might be. You can always surround yourself with people who agree with you. There's not a whole lot of utility in that. So my hope is that when this thing sinks, we can get enough people out of its wake that it doesn't just drag a bunch of people to the bottom of the ocean with them. Because I think the sinking is inevitable. But I like how you say that. I mean, you're just trying to let's save as many people from the heartache as we can, because it will take people out with it when it goes. It has before, it will again. So I appreciate you. I appreciate the book you've written. I think it helps sound an alarm. This Christian nationalist plague has got to be tackled head on, and it's really got to be tackled from people who are inside the church somewhat, who still believe in it. Who can be there to maybe help rebuild whatever's coming next. I don't know, and I can't even imagine, to be honest with you. I think it's going to take somebody with a lot more creativity than most of us to imagine what the next thing looks like, so that it just doesn't mirror what it's replacing. So,
there has to be a fall first, and that's unfortunate.
There has to, and I don't think that people. I mean, I always go back to, we had a guy on the podcast in Bio Hokomalafe, just a brilliant guy, and that was one of the things we talked about: deconstruction and reconstruction. And he was very adamant that we don't go like rushing off to rebuild. Like it might make sense to let the ground sit fallow for a season and let somebody else reimagine. Otherwise, we're just building. We'll rebuild the structure with the same materials. I mean, it might look different, but fundamentally, it won't be very different. But anyway, all that to say, thank you so much, man, for taking the time. I really appreciate you hanging out. appreciate the book very much. I hope it does really well for you. Is it available now, or is it releasing?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Anywhere you get books.
All right. So John will make sure, and we'll post links and everything to your podcast and to the book, and we'll promote the heck out of it. And I just wish you the best with that, man. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, so good to be on here again. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.